Salem Village, Massachusetts, 1692. A place that would become synonymous with paranoia, accusation, and state-sanctioned murder. The Salem witch trials are remembered as a moment of mass hysteria, a cautionary tale about superstition and fear. But that version of the story is incomplete. It avoids the uncomfortable truth that Salem was not an accident. It was engineered. And at the center of it all was a woman history remembers only by one name, TITUBA. She was enslaved. She was foreign. She was powerless. And yet her words would ignite the deadliest witch hunt in American history. 19 people would hang. One man would be crushed to death. Dozens would rot in jail. Entire families would be destroyed. And when it was over, TITUBA would vanish from the historical record as if she had never existed. To understand Salem, you have to understand TITUBA. And to understand TITUBA, you have to understand power. Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in Salem Village in 1689, bringing with him his household from Barbados. Among them was TITUBA, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin. Barbados was not just a sugar island. It was one of the most brutal slave societies in the English world, a hub of smuggling, illicit trade, and quiet financial arrangements between wealthy merchants and colonial elites. Enslaved people in Barbados were invisible in the most dangerous way. Masters spoke freely in front of them, assuming they were too ignorant or insignificant to understand. But TITUBA listened. In Salem, Parris was a divisive figure. His sermons were dark and obsessive, focused on sin, damnation, and invisible enemies. He quarreled constantly with his congregation over money, land, and authority. The village itself was deeply divided, family rivalries, property disputes, political grudges simmered beneath the surface. Salem was already primed for violence. It just needed a spark. That spark came in the winter of 1692, when Parris's daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams began to experience strange fits. Screaming. Convulsing. Claiming invisible forces were tormenting them. The village doctor, unable to explain their symptoms, suggested witchcraft. The question was no longer what was happening. It was who was responsible. Under pressure, under suspicion, and eventually under physical abuse, TITUBA was interrogated. Unlike Sarah Good or Sarah Osborne, who denied the accusations and would later hang for it, TITUBA confessed. But her confession was not what the magistrates expected. She didn't just admit guilt. She gave them a story. A vast conspiracy. A devil's book. Flying spirits. Animals that spoke. A tall man from Boston. A white-haired woman. Names that were vague enough to be interpreted but specific enough to feel real. It was exactly what the authorities wanted. Proof that they were not chasing shadows, but uncovering a hidden war against God. TITUBA had given them a framework. And once that framework existed, the village filled in the rest. Accusations exploded. Neighbors accused neighbors. Children accused parents. Old grudges were reborn as spiritual warfare. Property disputes became evidence of diabolical plots. Anyone who questioned the proceedings became suspect themselves. George Burroughs, a Harvard-educated former minister, was accused of being the ringleader of the witches. The evidence was absurd. He was strong for his size. He had outlived multiple wives. At the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something folklore claimed witches could not do. The crowd murmured. Perhaps he was innocent. Cotton Mather, watching from horseback, intervened. He assured the crowd that the devil could appear as an angel of light. The execution continued. John Proctor spoke out against the trials, calling the accusers frauds. He wrote letters begging for intervention. He was arrested. His wife Elizabeth was convicted but spared execution only because she was pregnant. John Willard refused to continue arresting accused witches after realizing how flimsy the evidence was. He was accused himself. George Jacobs Sr. was 80 years old, so frail he needed 2 canes to walk. His own granddaughter testified against him under coercion. Martha Carrier was labeled a rampant hag by Cotton Mather. Her children were tortured until they testified against her. The message was clear. You were either with the witch hunt or against it. And being against it made you dangerous. September 1692 brought the final executions. 8 people were hanged on September 22 alone. Mary East, sister of Rebecca Nurse, wrote a petition begging the judges not for her life, but that no more innocent blood be shed. She asked them to examine the accusers separately. To question coerced confessions. To do what justice required. Her petition was ignored. She was hanged. Martha Corey maintained her innocence to the end. Her husband, Giles Corey, met a fate even worse. Refusing to enter a plea so his property would pass to his sons, he was pressed to death under stones. When asked to plead, his only response was, "More weight." By the end of September, 19 people had been hanged. 1 had been crushed to death. At least 5 had died in prison. Dozens more awaited trial. And through it all, TITUBA sat in her cell. The magistrates had lost interest in her. Her confession had served its purpose. It had validated the conspiracy. She was no longer needed. Paris refused to pay her jail fees. In the bizarre accounting of the time, prisoners paid for their own imprisonment. Since TITUBA was enslaved, her owner had to pay. Paris did not. Whether from poverty, shame, or calculation, he abandoned her. Months passed. The trials collapsed under their own weight. Accusations began reaching prominent families. Even Governor William Phipps's wife was named. Spectral evidence suddenly seemed less convincing. Increase Mather, president of Harvard, published cases of conscience concerning evil spirits, declaring it better that 10 suspected witches escape than 1 innocent person be condemned. The court was dissolved. New rules were established. Spectral evidence was banned. Almost all remaining accused were released. The witch hunt was over. Except for TITUBA. She remained in jail. Alone. Forgotten. In chains. In April 1693, 13 months after her arrest, an unknown person paid her fees. £7. A large sum. The records list no name. TITUBA was released and immediately sold to satisfy the debt. 1 line in a ledger, TITUBA, Indian woman, sold to name illegible. Then she vanished. No death record. No property transfer. No diary mention. Nothing. For a woman at the center of the most documented event in colonial America, this absence is deafening. It suggests not neglect, but erasure. Some speculate she lived quietly elsewhere. Others suggest darker possibilities. What if she never truly left the jail alive? What if the person who bought her did so not to employ her, but to silence her? Enslaved deaths required little documentation. If she died shortly after her release, she would simply disappear from history. That disappearance mattered. Decades later, historians discovered something unsettling. In 1957, Marion Starkey found original court transcripts of TITUBA's testimony, unedited versions. They contained references that had been removed before publication. Mentions of Boston merchants. Prominent families. A man who visited the Paris household before the trials began, discussing problems in the village. Naming families who would later be accused. Those passages were excised. Why? Because TITUBA knew things. She had overheard conversations in Barbados. She had seen the same men move between trade, church, and politics. When threatened, she weaponized that knowledge. The tall man from Boston was not a demon. He was real. And real people with power could not afford exposure. The documents vanished again. The archives closed. Starkey refused to discuss the details later in life. Salem was rewritten as hysteria. A mistake. A tragedy without architects. But the truth is darker. Salem was the weaponization of fear by those with power. It was testimony valued over evidence. Confession extracted through terror. The vulnerable sacrificed to protect the comfortable. And TITUBA understood that. Her confession was not madness. It was strategy. A desperate act of survival by a woman who knew that innocence led to death. For a brief moment, she held the power to name, to shape narratives, to redirect violence. And for that, she became a liability. History remembers witches. It remembers judges. It remembers sermons and gallows. But it does not remember what happened to TITUBA. That silence is not accidental. Some ghosts don't haunt houses. They haunt archives. They haunt missing documents and blank spaces. TITUBA's ghost lives in that silence. The real horror of Salem isn't superstition. It's erasure. And 300 years later, the machinery that erased her is still running.